Well, welcome to Meck's online campus. What if I told you that what you most desperately long to be able to do, were made to do, created to do, and you will be forever restless until you engage it and do it. But if you're like most people, it's something you're not doing, at least not in the way you were meant to. Let me chase that a little further. What if I told you that every human being will spend their entire life searching for this experience? And they'll put almost anything in place to try to have the experience and go through the experience to satisfy the longing for it. But unless they experience the real thing, the substitute will never satisfy. Go further. What if I told you that right now you are substituting for this? I mean, you're one of those. If you're average, you're typical, you're already putting something in place of the real thing. You probably did it in some way, form, or fashion even today. And you probably weren't even aware of it unless you did it the right way and the right form. And you're probably wondering, what in the world is this guy talking about? What if I told you I'm talking about, and hang with me here, worship? I don't know what comes to mind when you hear that word or how it makes you feel. If I had to guess, it feels foreign to you. It feels weird. It feels uncomfortable, and you wouldn't be alone. But let's go back to where we started. You long to worship. I long to worship. And because of that, we tend to worship a whole bunch of stuff. We just don't call it worship or realize that it's worship. The word worship, and this will be helpful to get out right off the bat. It comes from an old Anglo-Saxon word, worthship. That's what it literally reads, worthship, which means that you worship when you bestow worth, honor, respect onto someone or something. In the Christian context, it's obviously giving honor and praise and worth to God. But you can give worth to anything. Take someone who has a favorite football team. I'm a Panthers fan, as all God's people should be. But if you're a fan, you watch every game on TV. You go to every game in person that you can. You dress for it. You put on face paint, or you wear your favorite player's jersey. I still have my old Luke Kuechly jersey. During the game, you scream, you chant, you laugh, you sing. You give every ounce of worth and honor and respect, loyalty and adoration and commitment you can to that team. Well, that's a form of worship. Or think about a musical artist. A couple of weeks ago, when tickets for Taylor Swift's latest tour went on sale, I mean, people went online for hours, or they stood in line for hours. And if they got a ticket, there were all these, things on TikTok where they were just weeping with joy. And if they didn't get a ticket, they were just weeping. They gave every ounce of worth and honor to those tickets to go into that concert, to honoring that artist. But it's not just for teams or musicians. You can give worth to anything. You can give worth to the accumulation of money, a position of power or fame, a possession like a house or a boat. There's just no such thing as a worshipless life, a worthshipless life. Our lives are filled with small W worship events and activities, whether related to people or things. I mean, you tell me what is important to your life, what you prioritize, what drives you on any given day, and I'll tell you what it is you are worshiping. But the kind of worship we were made for, if you're going to buy into what the Christian faith would say, the kind of worship that we were made for, created for, and long for is a capital W worship of the living God. And that worship will do more for us than anything we could ever put in its place, any substitute, anything else we could ever give worth or honor to. So as we kick off this little 3-week series, and I'm really excited about what we're going to be exploring, it may not be what you think, I want to start off with what worship, real worship, can do for us, what it can bring to bear on our life. And this is something that maybe you've not reflected on or heard reflected on. So let me just launch into it, beginning with its role in helping us order our lives around God. There's an old story that has always stuck with me. A radio broadcaster, which dates the story already, doesn't it? But a radio broadcaster said that a man wrote in to his station asking him to sound the musical note A on his morning show. He said that he was a shepherd of some kind, or cattle rancher or something, watching out on a remote ranch, but he was far from a piano. And his only comfort was his old violin, and it was completely out of tune. And so the radio host agreed and kind of had fun with it on his morning show, but he sounded the note on his show. And then he received a note back that simply said, "Thanks. Now I am in tune." A simple little story. I don't even remember where I heard that. It was years ago, but it reminds me what worship can be in our lives. This clear, solid note that allows us to retune our lives to God. It's an act, it's a moment, it's a practice that takes the fragmented pieces of our life that can be pulled in 1,000 different directions and brings them together in a sense of what really matters and where truth really lies and what is most important and what really anchors our life and puts everything else into perspective. Bringing all of our energies and senses to bear on the honor of God brings our lives into alignment with what is deepest and truest about our lives, which is always going to be spirituality. Worship is taking time to think about God and to reflect on God and consider God, creating a God sensitivity or mindset. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Excuse me. For example, take a look around you right now and find at least one thing that contains the color green. Okay? It could be the clothes you've got on. It could be what someone else who might be with you is wearing. It could be the paint on the ceiling or the walls. It could be a picture on your wall or some furniture. It could be, I've made it easy for you, I didn't even mean to, but my shirt. But find something that is green. Maybe a couple of 3 things that are green. Got it? Now, when I asked you to do that, something happened. You changed how you looked at what was around you. You created a green mindset. And when you created that green mindset, you began to see green in places you hadn't seen it before, or at least noticed green where you hadn't noticed it before. The reason is simple. We tend to see what we sensitize ourselves to see. We tend to think about what we sensitize ourselves to think about. Worship helps us open our eyes to God, to get a God mindset, a God sensitivity that we can carry with us for quite some time. Well, the second reason worship is so vital to our lives is that it helps us encounter and experience God. Not just become aware of him or sensitized to his existence, but to actually encounter and experience him. And isn't that what we most want spiritually, an encounter with the living God, experiencing his presence, having a taste of the transcendent, engaging a sense of the transcendent? No one wants dead, lifeless ritual. No one has an interest in dried out dogma. We don't want meaningless symbols and practices. We want to engage God. We want to experience God. And God wants that for us too. And he's designed a way for that to happen. It's worship. If you're not worshiping God, you're not experiencing him. This is really important. Let me not so much chase a rabbit, but expand on this a little bit. You don't really have a spiritual life. There's just life, and it's meant to be lived spiritually. And so the heart of the matter is, are you in a relationship with God through Jesus? And if so, is it a close one that is nurtured and cultivated and intimate? Run a personal diagnostic. If you're not attending to yourself spiritually, or if you are, either one, symptoms will be apparent. There'll be symptoms, signs. So let me just kind of give you some sample diagnostic questions. If someone were to ask you where you are growing spiritually or what you are discovering new about God, would you have an answer, or would it just catch you absolutely flat-footed with nothing to say? When it comes to God and you think about him, is he more concept or friend? Is he an idea or your father? What are you most comfortable talking about? God as a theological or philosophical construct, or your actual relationship with him? How often do you consider God's presence throughout the day? You really think about his presence, and you turn to him, you speak to him, you involve him, you engage him. When was the last time you felt a specific prompting come to you from God to act in a counterintuitive way as a result of time spent alone with him? Well, here's one last one. If someone were to ask you if you are more like Jesus today than you were 2 years ago, what would your most honest answer be? Well, Whatever your answer may be to any of those questions, it depends on whether or not you're experiencing God. And the key to experiencing God is worship. I could have added one more diagnostic. When was the last time you had an authentic moment of worship, either personal or corporate, with God, where you gave that to him? Because that's what takes you into a different level of living. Living on the surface of life is easy. I mean, days are so easily filled, aren't they? With activity and with noise and deadlines and duty. But your spirit, your soul, that which is able to engage and experience God, that's often beneath that surface of busyness. One of the areas that I've drunk deeply from in my own personal life is I've always been fascinated by ancient Celtic Christian spirituality, where St. Patrick came and brought the Christian faith to that area of the world and the vibrant Christian faith that grew there. But the ancient Celts knew that life had to be lived on both levels, that they had to be brought into union with each other, kind of the surface level of busyness, noise, and activity, and the lower surface, the beneath the surface of where spiritual life dwelt. And deeply rooted within Celtic Christian spirituality was what they called thin times. Not all time in their thinking was created equal, which is a biblical idea. And it doesn't afford the same spiritual benefits. So as it is, what we do with our time makes it either thin or thick. Thin times lets God in. Thick times keeps the work of the Spirit at bay. Worship, the Celts would say, is a thin time. Well, a third benefit of worship for your life is that it helps you respond to God. When you respect someone, when you have honor for someone, and particularly when you love someone, it's just natural to let those feelings be known. It's appropriate to let those feelings be known. You want to let those feelings be known. You want to tell them, you want to show them, you want to do something for them. Worship is one of the most personal, authentic ways to respond to God, both directly, personally, relationally. When you articulate your feelings and you express yourself verbally and emotionally and physically, it deepens and it cements your relationship with God. Think about how this works in other relationships. Say you're dating someone. Okay, what's the big line that you cross emotionally with them? One of the biggest relational lines of all. It's when you finally tell them that you love them. Or think about a strained relationship. What can cut through almost any disagreement or any strife, any conflict? It's when you remind yourself, okay, this isn't fun right now, but I do love this person. I love this person. It's no different with God. Expressing our worship to him is decisive to the relationship, which is why the Bible always presents worship in terms of some aspect of expression, such as in the 71st Psalm. Let me read that. And he writes, I will praise you with music on the harp, oh my God. I will sing praises to you with a lyre, O Holy One of Israel. I will shout for joy and sing your praises. Psalm 59, David, the king of Israel, said, I will sing about your power. Each morning I will sing with joy about your unfailing love, for you have been my refuge. Oh, my strength, to you I sing praises. Well, a fourth payoff is that worship helps you celebrate God. To celebrate God, and it's so important to have that experience of celebrating him and what it does for you. To celebrate God just takes time to remember all that he's done. And you just do this big, huge, yay, God. It's like having a party in his honor. And it's supposed to have that festive atmosphere to it. Worship is not supposed to be something, somber, and it's supposed to be energetic and celebratory. Take a look at the spirit of this through the 96th Psalm in the Bible, using where, the Hebrew word for God is being used, which is Yahweh. Sing Yahweh a brand new song. Earth and everyone in it, sing to Yahweh, worship Yahweh, for Yahweh is great and worth 1,000 hallelujahs. Bravo, Yahweh, bravo. Everyone join in the great shout. Encore, in awe before the beauty, in awe before the might. Bring gifts and celebrate. Everyone worship. Get out the message. Yahweh rules. Let's hear it from the sky, with earth joining in and a huge round of applause from the sea. Let wilderness turn cartwheels. Animals, come dance. Put every tree of the forest in the choir, an extravaganza before Yahweh as he comes. That's a party. And we need parties. Any good leader will tell you of the importance of taking time as a team to celebrate. If teams don't hit the pause button in the midst of the push and pull of what they're trying to accomplish together, to remember all that they have accomplished to that point, then they can lose their passion. They can lose their vision for the ongoing demands of the task. It's important to just stop and say, it's been a good season. So let's hit the pause button and just celebrate. Now, as important as that is organizationally, it's even more important spiritually. To hit the pause button and just remember, every good and perfect gift is from God. Everything good, everything noble, everything praiseworthy, everything that has worth and merit and truth and goodness, it's from Him, which moves your spiritual life forward. Because what moves your spiritual life from one that is lifeless to one that is passionate is to practice the celebration of the goodness of God. You're meant to celebrate all that He is, all that He's done, all that He's doing in you and with you and through you and for you. And when you do that, you just begin to see God in places and things and activities and circumstances that you never did before. Oh, one last one. Worship helps you receive spiritual encouragement and energy. Well, the primary purpose of worship is not what you get out of it, but what we give to God through it. When you gather together with others to worship, or you experience worship, privately, there's no way you can walk away without receiving an injection of spiritual energy and encouragement. And in many ways, particularly when you gather with others. I'll never forget traveling to Illinois when I got my first taste of this. When I was traveling to Illinois when I was in college for this huge gathering of university students that was sponsored by a campus Christian group called InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. It was right after I first became a Christ follower. And it was this missions conference, and more than 17,000 of us crammed into an auditorium on the campus of the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana on New Year's Eve. It culminated on New Year's Eve with a huge worship celebration. I'd never experienced anything like that before. What we didn't know was that the top of the auditorium had become covered with huge sheets of ice. Well, as we sang, and I'm telling you, 17,000 college kids bring a lot of energy, pouring our heart into this celebration of God, vibrations from our voices began to shake the ice loose. So as we were singing, we could hear these huge sheets of ice sliding off the top of the auditorium, serving as this thunderous echo and backdrop to the whole worship celebration. And I'll tell you, joining with voices with thousands of other people, hearing the rumble of ice coming off the building as we sang, and then at midnight, ushering in the new year, taking communion together, was simply one of the most remarkable shots of spiritual adrenaline I'd ever experienced up to that point. But that's the nature of worship. Now, I hope by now you see that worship is more than a service. A worship service can facilitate worship. It can encourage worship. It can provide opportunities for worship, but it itself isn't worship. Worship only happens when there is a worshiper. There's an old story about a man who went to church with an angel as his guide, and every seat in the sanctuary was filled, but there was something strange about the service. The organist moved her fingers over the keys, but no music came from its pipes. The choir rose to sing, and their mouths were moving, but not a sound was to be heard. The pastor stepped to the podium, the pulpit, to read the scriptures, and he opened up the Bible, but the man and the angel could not even detect the rustle of the pages. The Lord's Prayer was recited by the entire congregation, but not a single syllable was audible. The pastor went again to the pulpit, and the man watched as the minister gave what was obviously a talk, and he was gesturing here and there to make various points, but he heard nothing. So he finally turned to the angel, and he just said, "I don't understand. What does all this mean? I say a service is being held, but I hear nothing." And the angel replied, "Well, you hear nothing because there's nothing to be heard. You see the service, experience the service, hear the service, as God sees, experiences, and hears it. This is a worship service, but it has no true worshipers." So experiencing what worship has to offer your life depends on you actually being a worshiper, which takes a couple of things. First, understanding who it is you're worshiping, and letting that dynamic erupt in your life. And then second, knowing how to worship him and what is the actual ways that you do that, which is what we're going to explore in the next 2 installments of this little 3-week series. And it's going to be an interesting thing that, again, I think some of what we'll talk about will be very surprising to you. Who is this God we worship? What makes him worthy of it? Why should we be so moved? And then how practically do we do it? But I'll never forget just the importance of being a worshiper when I had my eyes opened to that, and to really have it be something that erupts in my life in a natural, authentic, even spontaneous way. To move beyond worship experiences and services, important as they are, to being a worshiper myself who can enter into these worship experiences and services and fill them with my worship. It was many years ago when I was serving as a visiting professor of what was then known as the Moscow Theological Institute. I was there for 3 weeks as part of a teaching team that went to work with young Russian pastors and Christian leaders who had never received any theological, biblical, or pastoral training. It was a fascinating time to go to Russia. It had only been just a few years since the fall of communism, during which times Christianity had been outlawed. Christians had been routinely persecuted and imprisoned. If you know anything about the timeline I'll remind you of this so you can get a sense of when I was there. Gorbachev had resigned his leadership as head of the Communist Party in 1991. The Central Committee was then dissolved. On December 25th, 1991, the Soviet hammer and sickle flag was lowered for the last time over the Kremlin. Gorbachev then resigned as president of the Soviet Union, not just as head of the Central Committee, but then as president of the Soviet Union, leaving Boris Yeltsin as president of the newly independent Russian state. Yeltsin made his first visit to the United States to Camp David in February of 92, where he met President George H.W. Bush and signed the document that officially ended the ideological and political/military confrontation that had been known as the Cold War, which had lasted for 40 years. 24 months after that, I was in Moscow. Freedom was something very new. It was still being experimented with, and it was not wholly trusted to last. Politically, it was unstable, and it was a very hard to predict time. Many of my Christian students still had the scars of their beatings. You could see the serial numbers that had been tattooed onto them from their time in the gulags where they had been imprisoned for their faith. They were a remarkable group of people. One night, we went to the famed Bolshoi Ballet. They wanted to take us to that, and it was a wonderful but long night. And at the end, I was exhausted. But after we took the subway back to where we were staying, the students said, "No, we must celebrate." And we had no idea what that meant. They said, "Just come celebrate with us." And so the other two professors with me were as tired as I was, but the students were so intent on us joining them that we said, well, of course. And so we found out what celebration meant to them. They wanted to gather in the dining room and sing hymns and pray and just worship God and celebrate him. And we did, late into the night, with more passion and sincerity than I've ever experienced, seen through the lives of these people. It didn't matter that we didn't sing in Russian. We worshiped God together about as sincerely and authentically and vibrantly as I ever have. And it just made me reflective. I had never seen such passion for spontaneous and heartfelt worship. Well, the next day, I gained even more insight into the passion that I had experienced the night before. I had been invited to speak at a church in North Moscow. It was a former underground church that met in secret, as so many churches had been, but they were now meeting openly in a schoolhouse. I had been asked to bring a message that Sunday morning. I didn't know that I was in for a bit of a wait. The service lasted for nearly 3 hours. There were 3 sermons, actually, from 3 different speakers with long periods of worship, mostly prayer and singing in between. And I went last. Well, when the service was over, I talked a bit with the pastor of the church through my interpreter. And I was surprised at not only the length of the service, I told him, but the spirit and the energy of the people. I mean, at the end of 3 hours, they were as into it as when we started. Even at the end, they didn't seem to want to go home. And it brought to mind that passion and that fervor I had seen in my students the night before. And I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, well, remember, it was only months ago that we would have been put in prison for doing what we did today. We were never allowed to gather together as a community of faith and offer worship to God. We're just so happy, and we're almost in a state of just unbelief that we can do this publicly together. And every Sunday we get together, we don't want it to end. And not knowing what the future might hold for us here, we also kind of assume, hey, this week could be our last. It could all end tomorrow. So we don't ever want to stop. So we keep worshiping together, as long as we can. And as I left, those words were just rattling around in my American brain. And I remember thinking to myself, I will never think about worship the same again. I've been too casual about it. I've been too laid back. I've taken it too much for granted. These people know what it's about. They really do. And because of that, they have been willing and would be willing again to suffer for it, to be imprisoned for it, to die for it. They've discovered that true worship is everything to their lives. I mean, they get it. And all I could think then was, if it could only matter that much to me. And it should matter that much to me. At least I want to order my life around God, encounter and experience God, respond to God, celebrate God, and receive the spiritual encouragement and energy that I so desperately need. Well, next week we'll take this a step further if you're game, and we'll get a fresh vision for exactly who it is we are worshiping, and we'll look at God through the experience of the most holy man of his generation and find out what was it about God, this God we worship, that caused that man to become undone. In fact, the Hebrew word used for what happened to him when he encountered the living God was that he disintegrated. What happened, and what was it about God? I mean, what? It's a fascinating scene to look at, and it has so much for us. And I think it'll open all of our eyes in ways that they haven't been opened before to this whole idea of worthship. Until then, let me pray for you. Father, I if we had announced in advance, hey, we're going to do a 3-week series on worship, I mean, a lot of people would have gone yawning and said, well, I'll see you in 3 weeks. And yet it's the most important thing. It's the most important thing. So I pray that we would, though it's a quick dive, it will be a deep dive into this, and we'll let it open our eyes anew, challenge our hearts anew, and we'll see how much of what we are longing for in life is tied in with this. And so I pray that we'll just hang with this series, get everything out of it you want us to get out of it, and understand this thing called worship and what it can mean for us. Well, I pray that in the name of Jesus. Amen.